Hello, in this video I want to just go over some tips for if you're taking college math classes. So I've been a teaching assistant for college math classes at the university level for a really long time, and I've also have taught some university math classes, and I've worked with students of all sorts of backgrounds. Some of them are very I don't know what, advanced, that's a good way to describe it. They're advanced math students. There are some students I've worked with who are also, afraid that they're going to fail the class on, day one. They walk in and they're worried that they're going to not pass the class. So there are a lot of different backgrounds of students at college math classes, but I want to give you some things that I've learned over the years that I think many students will find helpful. So one thing that's important, and this is kind of just, I don't have anything planned, it's kind of in no particular order, but one thing I've noticed is that a lot of students now rely on the internet to learn math. So a lot of them look on YouTube and look for videos to help them learn math, and I think that's great because they're taking initiative and exploring what's out there, but you have to be careful with using online videos because a lot of them are not good quality. A lot of them have mistakes, and a lot of them don't justify answers, or they, when they show their work, they show it in a very messy way that wouldn't be adequate, for a college math class. So one thing is, you have to be careful when you're watching online videos. Okay, so that's one tip when watching. So be careful when watching online videos. So for instance, one common mistake that you see in a lot of online videos is if you take the square root of x squared, that this is x, or this is, it's either x or this is, plus or minus x, and it's actually, right, what it should be is that the square root of x squared is x if x is positive or 0, and it's negative x if x is negative. I mean, this is somehow the correct thing. And a lot of the times you're just going to see the square root of x squared as x, but that's only true if x is greater than or equal to 0. So that's just one thing. It's a common misconception that the square root of x squared is just x. Okay. And that's something I've noticed in a lot of online videos. So you just have to be careful. But then the kind of more important thing is when you think about what you need to do to learn math, a lot of it is going to be finding personalized help. So first of all, you shouldn't be afraid to ask for help because, yeah, that's a good step. So ask for help. Ask questions, ask for help. Exclamation point. And if you're asking for help, it's not like you're giving up. It's like you're asking for a hint, right? It's important to ask questions. Now, what you shouldn't do is you shouldn't just ask someone, okay, how do I do the problem? Right? You shouldn't do that because you are the one who's supposed to figure it out. And yeah, but you shouldn't just never ask for help. I mean, you could, but I think it would be better if you ask for help if you've been spending a while and you don't know how to solve a homework problem or something. Ask for a hint or something. So you can if your university has a math help center, and a lot of them do, then you should go. And you should also go to office hours. So office hours are when the professor sets aside like a block of time, maybe it's, I don't know, twice a week or something, for an hour, and then it's time that they set aside for students to come in and ask questions. So that's something you should take advantage of. Now, if you're going to do that, and I recommend that you do that, so going to office hours or the Math Help Center, Math Study Center, things like that. If you're going to go, you should prepare a little, and you should think about what kinds of questions you have. So try to think about, specifically, if you're stuck on something, think about what it is you're confused about, right? Try to pinpoint exactly what it is. And you might not be able to do that exactly because you don't fully understand the material. So it might be kind of hard to actually know exactly what you're confused about, but you should make an attempt to do that. So instead of saying, I don't understand trigonometry, right? I mean, trigonometry is something that would take weeks and weeks and weeks to explain the main, everything there is to explain in a pre-calculus class. Okay, so saying you don't understand trigonometry, I mean, that's going to be hard for someone to work with. Something that's hard for your professor to address. But if you say, okay, I have questions about such and such trig identities, or how to use trigonometry to solve a problem, or something like that, then that's something that's more specific, and that's something that someone will be able to work with. Okay. So you should definitely go to office hours. You shouldn't not go to office hours. Like in every class, I mean, this goes beyond math class. You should go to office hours, I would say at least like 2 or 3 times throughout the course. But, you might go like every week or every other week just to get any questions you have answered. Okay. And the same thing with the Math Help Center. I mean, it's a good idea to get personalized help. Now, the thing is that these, right, what's nice about these as opposed to a video is that these are personalized. Like, you have a question, and then that person that you're speaking to, you're actually speaking to an actual person, and that person's responding to what you say. Now, if you watch a video, the person making the video doesn't know who you are. They don't know what kinds of questions you have. It's just a pre-recorded video, right? I mean, that's not an ideal way to get questions you have answered. You might be able to get your questions answered by watching a video, but generally speaking, I mean, instead of looking for a really long time for a video, it's better to ask someone, because I've seen so many instances of students looking for hours online, searching all these different videos because they have a homework question, they don't know the answer, and then once they actually talk to someone, the person realizes, oh, it's just this, and then 5 minutes later the question is answered. I mean, so spending hours watching videos and looking up videos is not an efficient way to go about learning something. Okay, if you have the option to ask someone in person, that's going to be better. So when you're doing homework, you shouldn't do it at the last minute, right? You should start your homework in advance. So start homework in advance. Not the day it's due or the day before it's due. Now this is going to take some planning because you have to think about Okay, when are you going to start the homework and that sort of thing. But do your best to start the homework in advance, and that at least attempt every problem a couple days before the assignment is due, so that leaves you time to actually ask for help, right? So you start the homework, you do what you can, okay, and then for any questions that you're stuck on, even if you think that you can figure it out at some point, just put a little star or check mark, or maybe not a check mark, but like a question mark or something, a star asterisk, to say, okay, this is a question that I'm going to come back to. And then find your professor or someone in a math help center and ask them for some clarification, even if it's just to make sure that you're on the right track, right? Even if you're pretty sure that you're doing it right, it's a good idea to just talk to people and get some confirmation about it. Okay, how long? I don't know how long I've been talking for. So yeah, I can't stress enough how important it is to actually talk to people, right? Talk to human beings. Don't just try to figure it all out kind of by yourself. So talk to people. Okay. Yeah, that's really important. The thing I notice is that a lot of students just never go to office hours. Now, even students who are doing really well in the class, even they get stuck sometimes. But the difference is that those students tend to be willing to ask for help. Like they don't have this reluctance to ask for help. So I've had students who after class will just go up to me and say, hey, I have a question about what you said here, I have a question about this, and they're persistent. If I answer their question and they get it, then they'll say, okay, I get it. But if there's still something that they're not really understanding, then they'll say, wait a minute, but I don't understand this, and then we keep going until they understand. Just things like going up to your professor after class and saying, I have a question, or going to office hours. And what happens if the professor's office hours are at a time where you have a class or you have something you need to do? Like maybe you have a job and you have to be working when your professor is holding office hours. Well, in that case, you shouldn't just say, well, I guess I can't go to office hours. I mean, you should ask your professor, you should tell them that those office hours won't work for you. It won't work for your schedule, but you would want to speak at a different time, and is it possible for you to meet with them at a different time? Right? Especially if your professor has office hours by appointment. What does it mean when your professor says that they have office hours by appointment? What it means essentially is that as long as they're not busy doing something else, they'll probably be happy to speak with you. Right? And partly it's in recognition, right? Part of the reason why professors have office hours by appointment is because they understand that not everyone will be able to make a set time. So if the professor says, okay, I'm going to have office hours on Monday and Wednesday from 10 to 11, some students won't be able to make it. So if the professor has appointments available, then you should definitely take advantage of that. And if the professor doesn't say that they have office hours by appointment, you should still ask them if they'd be willing to meet outside of their office hours. right? Or just how to get in touch with the professor outside of their office hours if those office hours aren't available. Okay? So that's kind of the basic thing. It's very important for your professor to get to know who you are, especially if you apply to things like internships. You know, if you're going to ask if you're going to ask a professor for a recommendation letter or something, they need to know who you are. Even if you did well in the class, that often is not enough. You need to make sure that they have things to say about you. And so if all they can say is that you did well in the class, that's not going to make a compelling letter, right? And if they don't have much to say about you, they might decline to write a letter because they're going to have trouble coming up with things to say. So if you go to office hours, you at least are making yourself present, right? You're giving the potential reference writer things to say about you. So you should go to office hours even if it's just because later you might ask for a recommendation letter, right? And you never know who you're going to ask for a recommendation letter. So you should definitely go to office hours and just introduce yourself, say more about you, say more about kind of what your major is or what your plans are, I don't know, things like that. Just so that the professor knows more about you. Ask some questions about the course material, right? It could go beyond just how to do the homework question. It could be just things like maybe you want to know more about how what you're learning will be applied in the future. So let's say you're an econ major or something and you're taking calculus and you're learning the chain rule and the quotient rule and the product rule and how to take the derivative of all these different types of functions. If you're an econ major, you could go up to them and say, hey, I'm interested in economics and I know that economics uses calculus and I want to know more about how the stuff I'm learning in this class is applied to economics. Now your math professor might not know because your math professor might not have taken economics in their entire life. I mean, maybe they don't know anything about economics, but they might be able to say something, and they know now that you're interested in economics. They know that you are asking some good questions. You're thinking about the course material. It's something. So that's something I would recommend. Okay, but it's very important to the issue for most students isn't that they ask the professor too many questions. It's usually that they just never go to the professor and say anything. Like that's and I've heard students say so many different things. I mean, even when I was in college, when I suggest going to office hours. So for instance, I was one of the people in the math, whatever it was called. I don't think they called it a tutoring center, but that's essentially what it was. Students would have questions about linear algebra, and they'd come in, and I was an undergrad, so these were people that I knew, and they would ask questions about, homework. Yeah, I have a question about number, 20 or whatever on the homework, and then students would kind of come together and ask questions and work on homework, and I'd be there to answer whatever questions they have. And at one point, I suggested to the students that they go to office hours, and one of them basically said, well, I heard that professors are really busy and I didn't want to bother them, so I just never went to office hours. I mean, at some point you have to, and it's true that professors are busy, but you have to like advocate for yourself. Right? You have to say, hey, I'm the student taking the class. Your professor is not the one getting the GPA. You're the one whose GPA is on the line. You have questions. You need to take advantage of the opportunities that are available. Okay, so just take advantage of all the opportunities that are available, and there's a lot of them. Okay, and you should try the different possibilities. And by the way, you shouldn't listen too much to what your friends say. So for instance, let's say that you're taking calculus and you heard about the Math Study Center. And you're thinking to yourself, okay, maybe I'll go. And then you're talking with your friend who's taking the class, and your friend says, yeah, I went there, they're not helpful. Okay. And when you hear your friend saying that, you might think, well, my friend said that they're not helpful, so maybe I just won't go. Maybe they're actually not helpful. I would say, forget what your friend is saying. Well, not forget what your friend is saying, but just take it with a grain of salt and just go anyway. Just go anyway and just try it. Usually what happens in these math study centers is that they have lots of different people, and sometimes some people are more helpful than others. It's a matter of finding the tutor who you get along well with, who you kind of gel with, and who will help you, right? I mean, you may have to search around to find someone who you feel comfortable asking questions to, who you feel is really helpful, that sort of thing. Okay, so don't just say, well, I had this, I talked to this one tutor and they weren't helpful, so I'm just never going to go to the Math Study Center ever again. I mean, don't do that, Just be aware that there's lots of different tutors. Some of them are going to be just better at explaining things, better at answering questions than others. Okay. So the common theme is, just to hammer down the point, you shouldn't rely too much on online videos or just unpersonalized things. You should try to get personalized help. That's going to happen when you're actually talking to people who you trust, who can answer your questions, who would be happy to answer your questions. And you can find these people. Often your professor will be happy to answer your questions, and also at any tutoring, free tutoring, math help center, just look for the different resources that your college or university has, and you should definitely take advantage of it while you can. Okay? Like, don't be embarrassed. I mean, don't be shy, just even, and why not just go once? You just go once and just see what happens. Nothing bad is going to happen to you by asking for help. Okay, so those are some of the tips that I have. Those aren't the only tips though. Let's talk about test preparation and taking tests. So, I'm going to assume that you're at a university where you are in one of those classes with lots of other students. So, for instance, if you're at a big university, your calculus class might have 150 students. If you're at a community college, the classes are generally smaller. But let's say that you're in one of these big universities, and on the first day of class, the professor goes over how the grades are going to work, and the outline is something like X percentage is on homework, Y percentage is on these midterms, and then Z percent is on the final. That's often how it works. It's like, I don't know, maybe 15 to 20% on the homework, and then the midterms are like 20 to 25%, and then the final is somewhere between like 30 and 40 or something. Something like that. So what that means is that most of your grade is going to depend on how well you do on these tests. And usually the tests are timed. So for instance, the midterms, you might have anywhere between 50 minutes, so that's a class period, to an hour and a half or an hour and 15 minutes to do some problems. So they might be like 5 problems and you have 50 minutes to do it, right? And you may or may not have a note sheet available. And you need to do well on these to do well in the class, because a big percentage of the grade is based on how you do on these tests. Okay, let's talk about how these tests go. So you should think of these tests. Okay, so these tests, you can think of these tests as like a game. Oops. Think of the tests that these are. I'm assuming that these are timed tests. Okay, a lot of professors are reluctant to give non-timed tests, like take-home tests, because I think most professors know that some students are going to cheat. They're going to use ChatGPT. They're going to be looking at books. They're going to be asking friends. They're going to be cheating, basically. So a lot of professors only give timed tests to prevent cheating. So think of timed tests as a game. Okay. Your goal is to get as many points as you can. That's the goal of a timed test. So if you have 50 minutes, you have 5 questions, you need to rack up as many points as you can in those 50 minutes. And it's like those games where, you have 5 minutes and you need to get as many points as you can doing like, I don't know, whatever. Just imagine some game where you have 5 minutes and you have to, your goal is to get as many points as you can. That's basically what a time test is, okay? Now you don't have to finish necessarily all of the questions to do well on the test. You don't have to necessarily get everything right to do well on the test. You just need to get a good enough score to if you're interested in passing, then you would want to get a passing score. If you want to get like an A in the class, then you would need to get a fairly high score. So the goal is to get as many points as you can. And to do that, you have to get as many questions right as you can. And you also, for the questions that you're not sure, you need to try to get as much partial credit as you can. And mostly, these tests are graded on a rubric. So for instance, okay, what happens? Well, I'll just tell you what happens at big universities that I'm familiar with. It might be different depending on the university, and certainly at a community college it might be different. But basically, what happens if you have a class where you have a bunch of TAs is so you get tests, you're in this lecture hall with a bunch of other students, you take the test, and then what happens? What happens is the test gets scanned, and probably on Gradescope or something like that. And then the TAs and the professors go home, and then when they have time, they go online, they log in, they see the test, and then they're either emailed or they're somehow sent a copy of a rubric, right? A rubric is basically a checklist of the things that your solutions need to have in order to get the points. So in order to get the points, you need to, if the rubric says, 3 points for doing this, 3 points for doing that, and 4 points for doing that, then to get the points, you need to do those things. And if you do those things, you'll get the points. If you don't do those things, you won't get the points. So try to get a sense of what the important steps to show are for each problem. And usually you'll get a sense of that by looking at the kinds of questions that your professor goes over. You kind of see how they write out the solutions. You look at how your TA presents the solutions to questions, and then you get an idea of, okay, this is what I need to demonstrate to get the points, right? So one of the things that I notice is that some students will bomb the test. Like, let's say it's the first midterm. They bomb the test, and then they'll be concerned because they're worried about their grade, and then they'll say things like, well, I understand the concepts, like I understand what's going on in class, but I'm not doing well on the test. Or they might say things like, well, I'm getting 100% on the homework, but I'm still failing the test. Okay, let's talk about what's going on there. So this is where thinking about things as a game and understanding how it all works is important. You need to understand that, like, there are just certain things you have to do to get the points. And there are certain things you have to write down to get the points. And things like doing well on the homework is great, and understanding what's going on in class, like paying attention to the lecture and taking notes and understanding the examples and the explanations that your professor is giving, I think that's great. But that's not by itself going to translate to a good score on the test. Because to get a good score on the test, what you need to do, if you're given these 5 questions, is you need to answer those questions. And you need to answer them well, right? You need to come up with the correct answer. You need to show your work, justify your answer, and do that. So, you could do well on the homework, but still not be able to answer the questions on the test. So how do you increase the likelihood that you will answer the questions on the test correctly? That's how you want to think about it. Well, you need to practice answering those types of questions. So yeah, you want to practice doing this kind of thing, right? So one way you could do this is to look at practice tests. You could look at questions from the textbook. So for instance, if your textbook has problems in the back, you can do those and then check your answer. At least for the odd ones, they often have answers. You have to be careful with those because oftentimes there are mistakes with the answers in the back. But a lot of the times, most of the time, the answers in the back will be correct, right? Like 95% of the time it will be correct. It's just that 5% where there's a mistake. Okay. Or you could, if you have worksheets, you can use those as practice problems. If you have quizzes, like weekly quizzes, you can use those to quiz yourself. Just do the problem on a sheet of paper and then check with the answer. You can do the same with the examples that your professor does in class. So let's say your professor just goes over some sample problems and then goes over the answers. Well, you can cover up the answers, right? Just don't look at the answers and then just try doing the problem yourself and then compare with the answers. Okay. So those are ways that you can get practice answering the types of questions that might show up on the test. And then one thing that's important to keep in mind is that, okay, let's think about how professors write these tests, okay? So it's going to depend on the class, but in my experience, what happens is the professor looks at they look at, so here's your homework, right? Here's your homework. Here's any quizzes that your professor wrote. And then there's also things like worksheets that you might do with your TA. There might be things like problems that were done in class. So examples that they did in class. There could be textbook problems, so problems from the textbook. Okay, you need to study all these things, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different sources of test questions, right? I mean, your professor is going to see this whole thing. They're going to be thinking about all of this and then asking, okay, these students, they had to do these types of questions, so I'm gonna pick questions that are similar to that, and they should be able to do it because they had to do that on a worksheet, on homework, on the quiz, whatever. All right? I mean, they might ask questions where you have to think outside the box a little, where you're not supposed to have seen that exact type of problem before, but you're supposed to kind of think on the spot. Now, that does happen sometimes, but most professors will not make the majority of the test those types of questions. So there might be 5% of the points might be this question that you haven't seen before, but 95% of it is going to be based on things that were discussed in class. That's more likely, especially in these big classes where you have hundreds and hundreds of students, because they don't want students to say, well, you never went over how to do it in class. Right? So these are the kinds of things that you would want to go over. So you need to go over everything. Now, one thing that sometimes students do is they will look at practice tests. So for instance, let's say that the university posts, let's say you're taking calculus, okay, and you're taking Calc 1 and you want to know, okay, what the previous exams look like. Of course, that's very natural. Of course you want to know what the previous exams look like, right? I mean, that's not a bad thing. And then you look at the different practice exams. The mistake is to only look at the practice exams. So what some students do, which you are not going to do if you want a good grade in the class, what some students do, this isn't you, is they only look at the practice test. They look at the practice test, they see, oh, these were the questions that showed up on the practice test. And then they think, well, all I need to do is know how to do the questions that were on the previous practice test. No, in reality, okay, you want to think about these questions, okay, these questions. Like, think of it as like one big pile. You have all these questions like this big pile, okay? Your old tests, the old tests are gonna be like maybe one question here, one question here, one question here, one question here, and one question there. So if you only know how to do these 5 things in blue, you're in trouble because your professor's going to make the test and say, well, okay, I'll pick this question, that question, that question, that question, and that question. And then before you know it, you realize, wait a minute, I only know how to do the questions that were in the blue dots. I don't know how to do anything in the purple dots. And you're gonna bomb the test. And then you're gonna be like, what? But I looked at the practice tests and I figured out how to do those problems and what's going on. And what's going on is you probably didn't study everything, right? This whole thing is what you need to study. Not just, if the questions on old tests are like this, the blue dots, you don't just study the blue dots. You study like all the dots in these 5 piles, okay? And you need to make sure that you can do them in the time that you have. Well, you need to do as many as you can in the time that you have. Again, like I said, you don't necessarily have to get 100. You don't have to, get every single question right. In fact, most students don't, but they still do fine in the class because you don't need to get 100% in order to do well in the class. Okay. So don't just look at practice tests. Looking at practice tests is fine, it's a good idea, but you need to study everything, not just the questions that were on old tests. By the way, it might vary depending on the class, but I'm just saying that in my experience, you need to study different things. Of course, you might take a class where the professor, like the week before, gives you a review and then just takes the questions from the review and changes them a little, then okay, that might be different. But most of the time, that's not the case. Okay. Okay, there's more I want to say, but this is a long enough video. In a future video, I'll talk about things like, what do you do if you fail the test? What do you do then? Another thing I'll talk about is, so I kind of talked about how to study. You want to go over these things, you want to do practice questions, but okay, what happens if you fail the test, let's say, and I'll talk about things like, what else is there to go over? Maybe things like how to take notes or how to go over a lecture and things like that. Okay, so some more tips in a future video.